Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
Well, hello. We're back.
We're back, and it's February now.
Yeah, I've missed you, Sasha. You know, we have our regular meetings, and then we really didn't very much at all chat.
Yeah, we felt very distant. You felt like some just far-off lady in Ireland that I used to talk to every single week. So it's nice to be back. We should have definitely connected during that break anyway, but we just got busy with our lives.
Yeah. And I felt it. I did feel it. I felt the difference. You know, it can feel a bit relentless doing the podcast every week, and yet not doing it. I felt the lack of it.
I know. It's nice to be back. How was your break?
It was good. The usual family stuff at Christmas. Then hanging out a lot more with the kids and stuff. I've made a resolution, which I'm determined to keep, but I'm already failing at. But that doesn't mean it will be a failure. To work less. That's what I want to do.
Okay.
I want to work less. It's hard.
Are you thinking specifics about that, or just broadly? Like, how are you doing it?
Broadly. Just trying to kind of say, right, that's it for today. Right, that's it for today.
Okay.
You know, leave the phone up in the room.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So I'm not bringing it downstairs. But weirdly enough, when I stopped, this is a mad little thing. When I stopped working so much, kind of around New Year's, I suddenly started obsessively playing chess, like some sort of freak.
Stella.
I know.
Oh my God.
I know, they're like all giving out. Bo Henry and the kids.
Maladaptive coping mechanism.
Total.
You're distracting yourself
with the most intense, aggressive game known to man. Like, what the hell am I doing? Like, it's moving from the frying pan into the fire. I was so disappointed with myself. And the kids and Henry both said, like, lose the chess. You're becoming a nightmare around it.
Oh my God. Well, I just want to start by saying, if you think chess is the most aggressive game known to man, you are quite innocent and adorable, because there are much more aggressive games out there in the world, like rugby, football.
You don't know chess if you say that. There is nothing more aggressive than chess. Nothing.
I don't play chess, so I have no idea.
It brings out a killer in you. It brings out the madness. Anyway, how was your break?
My break was good. I also got to kind of step away from work. I traveled and visited family and, had fun, ate a lot of great food. I also got food poisoning the day before New Year's. Oh. So I was in bed I was in the bathroom for like 6 hours straight. And then I slept from, I would say, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. the next day. And so I missed all of New Year's. I was like shivering under blankets and the fireworks were going off, and kind of like I was in a delirium of sleep, like hearing fireworks, but not really. So that was unfortunate.
Wait, what was it? What was the food, or where did it come from?
I think it was a chicken tandoori. It was so delicious, going down from like my favorite Indian restaurant in Florida. And I was really upset, but I'm not going to give up on the dish. I'm going to try it again one of these days, but just not anytime soon. But I mean, I don't want to make it sound like my break was terrible. That was a terrible day. But overall, I had a really great time, and have just enjoyed, just kind of stepping away from the daily routine of work. And it was really, really nice.
Did I hear you say that you became a little less obsessed, unlike me, a little less obsessed with gender for a couple of days, maybe?
Well, I mean, broadly speaking, I think I go through waves where, I'm super absorbed and intense and constantly consuming information and thinking and taking notes about things I want to say. And like, I'm full of ideas. And then I go through periods of lull where I'm just like, I don't have the patience for this. And I just want to be in my real life, and be in the tangible 3D world. So I definitely go through kind of cyclical phases like this. And that happens with me very commonly with a lot of things. A lot of interests that I have and passions that I have, I go through phases where my engagement is like really, really absorbed. And then other times when I just like
Right.
don't have the patience, I guess is the best framing. But I don't know if that happens for you, but I'm in a weird space around that here. And I think it's just because also, being part of this world, which this is, we're going to talk about this today, it kind of puts you in like an advocacy role, and
Yeah.
you feel like you're fighting the mainstream all the time. And
Yeah.
I don't have that kind of like fighter spirit in me. I mean, which may surprise listeners because people are always like, "Oh, you're so brave." And I'm like, no, I'm not. I just say what I think is true. But I can't sustain that like fighter spirit for very long. I get really tired of it. I am a very go with the flow kind of person, actually. So after a while in the kind of gender world where it's like, I want to hear your comment on this, and what do you think about the affirmative care model? I just get tired of constantly being
Conflict.
against something. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
That's such a
Do you
good
have
point.
that?
I do. It's really resonating with me, and people would be surprised to think that about me as well. But like in company, I don't really want to argue a point. And if I think that they don't get gender, my instinct is to avoid it. And if I'm
Yeah.
out with my husband, I watch him. He's rabid. He's dying to bring it up. He's dying to throw it on the table and let's
Yeah.
talk. And I'm like kind of often saying, just don't bring it up. I can see him circling in it, and I'm like, don't, because
Yeah.
I haven't the energy. And then I feel bad because I think I should be speaking up, and but it feels like such a thing to bring when you're in mainstream land, to
Yeah.
bring gender in. You're going off piste. You're going to take over the conversation for some time. It's bringing in something it's like saying, now let's talk about the war. It's like, okay,
Totally. Yeah. It's
here we
really
go.
intense topic for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. So I do have the very same when I'm out and about, just socializing. I don't want to talk about it. I just,
Yeah.
if at all possible, I don't want to. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's awkward.
Yeah, for sure. Well, today, shall we jump into the episode?
Definitely. I think it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so we were kind of talking about how a lot of people, when they start looking into gender, it's very absorbing, and they get really interested and they want to get involved and they start reading and learning. And if you make any public statements, or you start talking about gender, what happens is you get further sucked into it, and sometimes you also get kind of exiled from other fields that you work in, or aspects of your life, or friend groups you're part of, or whatever. And there are lots of different kinds of people who go through this. Of course, we've seen it with journalists, we've seen it with biologists, like look at a Colin Wright, for example, or, so many people. But specifically, we were talking about therapists and how therapists try to straddle this line between like, oh, I want to maintain my old practice, which let's say was focused on BPD or on anxiety or OCD. And I also want to take some gender patients. And then they find themselves kind of like, for lots of reasons, which we'll cover today, unable to do both.
Yeah,
And then you get into gender and you realize like, yes, there are some basic psychotherapy principles which we use here.
very much so.
But also these young people have a deeply held belief system, which is very rigid and recalcitrant to challenge. Many of them are indoctrinated. So if you're dealing with anxiety disorders or OCD, you're not necessarily dealing with indoctrination. So you get into gender and there's like a whole new can of worms that you've opened up that some therapists find very challenging.
There's so much in what you said. For starters, just on the last thing you said, you're dealing often with an indoctrinated client. So therefore that's the primary almost thing that you have to be aware of, that there's indoctrination here, and now from there I will unfold. But often people don't view it like that. They view it first with gender as opposed to indoctrination. And actually, they'd be better off. I think therapists would be better off. But as well as that, I think therapists would be better off focusing on indoctrination rather than gender. But as well as that, we know from our listenership and from our lovely emails and comments and stuff, so many therapists are messaging us. And we also know from working, in the field, that not so many therapists are working in gender. So it's like I find so many of them, they write to me, let's say in Ireland, they write to me saying, I'd love to have a coffee if you come to Dublin. I'll come down to Burr if you want. They just want to talk to me about gender. They're a therapist, and they might have one client, or they might have had one client. They're afraid to go further, and they've become kind of increasingly obsessed with it. And they can't quite believe that they're obsessed with it, and they don't know why they're obsessed with it. And suddenly they're seeking me out to talk to me about gender. And I know what they want to talk about. They just want to talk about, this is the strangest thing. Do you know what I mean? And so there's all these therapists that are listening to us, and I think they're rightfully absorbed. I think it's a very, very compelling subject. I think a lot of people undermine it as a subject and make it seem like it's very superficial, when actually it arguably goes to the essence of what makes me me. And so I think there is a lot of depth in it, and there's all sorts of other political aspects to it. But I think of myself, because that's the thing you began with. I first got into gender. I did that film in 2018. And in my brain, I was going to go back and be a general psychotherapist. And I was determined I was going to stay and be a general psychotherapist. And I released a book on anxiety about 5 months. It's called Fragile. And I always thought it got completely overshadowed by gender. But I released it about 5 months after my film. So the film came out in November, and I think my book came out something like April in 2019. And I was determined that I was talking about anxiety. I was talking about anxiety. It was going to be anxiety. And just gender just kept on pulling me back. All the emails you get, all the conversations, all the articles are so interesting that no matter how much I tried to stay as a general psychotherapist, I couldn't. I just couldn't. It was like almost like the tide pulling you. Yeah. It was just pulling me again and again and again towards gender. Everything I ended up in was, I do a little bit on anxiety and then absolutely immerse myself in gender for hours, then a little bit more on anxiety. So I'm a living example of it.
And I also think, you can help me understand the cultural context in Ireland, but I also think for a lot of therapists that we meet here in the US and in Canada, and a lot of people feel that, well, not feel that, recognize that starting to voice any thoughts about gender creates a kind of, they can end up on some sort of a blacklist where actually they can't be hired for anxiety or OCD or the other things in their practice. Like, I don't get the sense that that was precisely the case for you in Ireland, but here in the US, therapists who start talking about gender are really marginalized and sidelined.
Well, I could have easily been, and I have been, by certain, RTE, the national broadcaster, Don't Touch Me, and they used to have me all the time. While News Talk, the other radio station, have me, but they've taken their position on gender. So it has evolved since 2018, 2019. At the time, they were taking me, but very much, and we're not talking about gender, missus. And then over the years, then I became pigeonholed. I just,
And they wanted to talk about gender.
They wanted to talk about gender, and they didn't touch me about other stuff. So I kind of pigeonholed myself. I watched it happen in slow time. Other people, it seems to happen faster in other countries. But gender was not big in Ireland in 2018, 2019. Yeah. It wasn't big. Now it is.
Yeah. In my own experience, what happened was I started my practice at the time while I was still working in the middle school, and I was taking patients at night, after school, and just kind of dipping my toe in the water. And originally when I set up my practice, I said that I work with gender and body image issues. Oh, but everybody contacting me was contacting me about gender. And I maybe had one person contact me about body image issues. And so I saw how the need for the gender work was so much greater.
Me too.
And of course, it was just not a saturated market because there were very few therapists doing it. And in my real life, when I'm out about in the world and I say that I'm a therapist, a lot of people say, oh, my, daughter is dealing with anxiety with friends. Can you see her? Normal kind of common, let's say, common issues. And of course, I don't take other patients at this point, and I'm full anyway. But it is interesting to see how I started off willing to be somewhat
Oh, I
broad, but
see.
the market kind of just drove me in that
And
direction
I
because
was the
that's what's
same, like
needed.
for every, like I've always, and I will always get emails about bullying. I wrote a book about bullying years ago. And for all the emails I get about anxiety and bullying, gender beats it 20 to 1. Like
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah.
doubt about it. What is the issue that needs therapists? And that's why I wanted to do this episode. That I think there's an awful lot of therapists who aren't willing to work in it because they're scared. They're scared of being blacklisted. They're scared of being unpopular. They're scared of losing their job. They're scared of financial hit. They're scared of a lot of things, and some of them are true, and some of them are missing huge opportunities as well, because it is a very, very compelling field. You can help people in a major way, and there's an awful lot of work in it. We need therapists. So, I don't know. I feel for them.
Yeah. Well, this is the real dilemma, right? Because if people, so we know about a therapist who had a very, very successful practice working in not gender at all and started
Yeah.
making, posts and commentary about gender related issues. And her following really blew up in a positive way, but her actual business in these adjacent fields really dried up and she was very much ostracized. So she kind of felt it was unsustainable to keep talking about gender. And so, this kind of raises this point that we touched on earlier, which is if you're going to dip your toe in the water, you might as well dive in because, in especially in America, in certain cities, it is kind of an either or. Either you're dealing with gender almost full time or you're staying away from it altogether. And then, you kind of have to make this decision. And what we've encountered, Therapy First, formerly GETA, Therapy
Yeah.
First is one of our sponsors for the show. And we have a lot of therapists who listen to the show who contact us all the time, just like that lady who contacted you, who say, I have a patient or a couple of patients or several patients, and working with them is really different
Yeah.
because I feel like I can't really say what I think or challenge them or push back. And so when therapists start to do this work, what you realize is like you're dealing with a different type of presenting problem and you can't necessarily approach it the same way. Now, our principles of psychotherapy are foundational and they are always informing the work. But in terms of how you interact with these patients, I have I have developed a completely different way of dealing with this that allows you to work with an indoctrinated person without kind of bursting their bubble too early. I think that's the challenge that a lot of therapists will share, that like, I tried to just lay down some facts about reality, for example, and this blew up and it did not go well. And so there's a real kind of gentle approach that therapists have to take. And it takes time to figure that out.
It does. And I'm really glad you're lifting this point, because if a therapist comes and they think that they're going into the usual context of therapy, which is somebody comes in, they might talk about their partner or about school or about something else. And then actually you think there's something else going on. You know what I mean? So you're going into the usual field of gender, or not gender, of therapy, I'm obsessed, of therapy. And you're fine and you're rolling along and you've got your suspicions about what's going down, but you're not bursting anybody's bubbles. You're letting them find their own way, and you're following their pace and watching the pace at the same time. And then you realize this person is completely indoctrinated. They're completely indoctrinated, and therefore I need to be in a very different realm than what I would be if this person was maybe anorexic or something. Because if they were anorexic, I would be working along, they would be talking about their issues, and I would know, because I've worked in this field for so long, that there will be a day of a capitulation. There will be a day of, I think I have a problem. They'll come in, they'll be weak, they'll be distressed, and they'll say, I think I have a problem with food, or I've got something to say,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
a very special and sad moment. It might be the same about alcohol, it might be the same about OCD or panic, that it's taken me over, and I now know you and trust you enough to know, can we work on this, because I've got something here, and it's
Yeah.
frightening me. And that's a very special moment in therapy, and we know it, and then we work with them, and it's very slow and we're rebuilding. That's not going to happen with gender. And so somebody who's working from that playbook is on the wrong book, and they need to be in a different book completely. And I think this is where you've really kind of led the field, Sasha. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like, no, you're with an indoctrinated client who will never come in and say that. It's very much like, and I've had clients who are very religious, and they're telling me, well, I did an Avena and I did this, and I know God is going to come through about this, and I have to walk with that. And I can't say, well, God doesn't exist. I don't think God, I can't do that. So they might be praying and they might be doing various different things, and they can be quite elaborate so that they, for example, have a baby. And I'm like going,
Right.
I can't puncture that, but I also have to stay in reality. And so this is a dual role that I have to take. And other people, because of the politicization of gender, people, therapists think that's fake. And I'm like, yeah, but it wouldn't be fake if they were religious. You would just
Yeah.
accept that they are religious, and I'm not,
Yeah.
who am I? Who am I to get in the
Yeah.
way of their religion? So because I suppose I've definitely had quite a few very religious clients, it gave me the water to swim in. Do you know what I mean? That I could roll with it, just thinking that's their coping mechanism. That's cool. Let's look at everything else. Is that
Yeah.
kind of where
Yeah,
you're? Yeah,
totally. And actually you and I recently did a kind of a workshop slash
webinar. Yeah,
consultation with CTA.
yeah.
And we critical therapy antidote with several therapists there who brought a lot of questions that they have about, patients they're seeing, or like what happens if this patient type of patient comes in or not. And I thought that analogy that you used, you shared it there, it was so good, because when people have a strongly held belief, it's not up to us to tell them whether or
Wrong.
not the belief is accurate.
Yeah,
And I think that's precisely where people get confused about affirming therapy versus not affirming
true.
therapy. You have to hold it gently. And
Yeah,
in the back of your mind as the clinician, you keep that thought, okay, this
yeah.
person, maybe sees their breasts as the root of all of her problems. I'm not going to point that out yet, but I'm going to store this for a time when intuitively it feels like the right moment, or
Put it
maybe
in your
something
back pocket.
relevant comes in. Yeah, exactly. You kind of just keep it in your back pocket for the right moment. And meanwhile, you do not see it as your job to kind of like fact check every moment in therapy. That's not what the therapy is about. It's not a fact checking session.
Yeah.
And particularly because a lot of these young people also have kind of autistic traits, and they do tend to think in black and white ways. If you kind of challenge something like that, it could completely derail the entire conversation. Like maybe they were getting to something, and then if you interrupt that with a fact check, you might have lost the rest of the session. Now, sometimes that's the right move, because you want the client to kind of let their wheels turn and think about that disruption, right? But I do think there's it's like a different pace that is required here. And it's very, very slow. It's very, very gentle. And you're kind of, as I said in the CTA meeting, you're almost playing a little bit of a detective. You're trying to understand what's going on without putting out your cards, without necessarily saying, here's what I think is going on. You're really being gentle and slow. And I think having that approach, in my experience, I've been really fortunate to work with some clients on a very long-term basis. Sometimes there are moments where they come in and say, is all this gender stuff a way to make sense of this or that thing? And it's not going to happen in the first, year. But this can be the case if there's a space of curiosity and like a radical acceptance of whatever they say without taking it literally. And I think, like in my experience, I think therapists have a hard time when they come into the relationship in a way that's adversarial. These kids are already so defensive. They're so protective over their identity. And when therapists come in with a very kind of directive and confrontational approach, it is not a recipe for success. And actually, this is also making me think about something I'd like to get your thoughts on. A lot of other therapies, the explicit aim is to reduce the distress.
Oh
But
yeah.
I find kids with gender dysphoria are protective over the distress. They want to have their gender dysphoria because it justifies their gender identity in a lot of ways. Now, I think kids are often experimenting with labels and looking at definitions first, then they adopt one, then they develop gender dysphoria. So I have noticed that this kind of goes in a backwards fashion. But a lot of kids don't actually want to get rid of their dysphoria and, quote, become cis.
Yeah, I think you're dead right. And something strange happens because I often think when I'm working with them, I'm thinking, I can see where you could be distressed, but you're not being distressed about that. And you're saying you're distressed about this when honestly, this is the gender dysphoria that they've manifested. And I'm like, I don't see the distress there, but I do see where there's lots of room for distress over in this part of your life. And they're like, in an incredibly disconnected manner, they're like, no, that's perfectly fine. No, that was fine when my parents did this. And no, that was fine. And I'm like, really? Really?
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, absolutely. So I often find no more than a disconnect from their body, which I often see, there's a disconnect from their emotions. And so, there's a word for it, I can't think of it, alexithymia or something.
Alexithymia, I think.
Yeah, when you're not able to connect with your emotions, you're not really sure what's going down with you. And
Yeah.
I find with those, and that could be the autism. I know there was a point, when I started seeing teenager first, and I thought, actually, there's a certain type of young boy, especially if they're 12 or 13, I can't see them. They're not connected with their emotions, and they're sitting there blinking, going, I don't know. And they are just not there. And I realized you have to have a certain level of insight to benefit from psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And if you are somebody who has autism or who is not very connected with your emotions, you could easily be almost not insightful enough for therapy. And that will need, if you are, that could take quite some time for the therapist to say, okay, I'll work with this person, but I'm going to be building insight for the first year because they're not ready. So this is like pre-therapy, really, to get them there. Now, when parents realize that, they're like, oh my God, it's going to go on and on and on and on. And I'm like, well, yeah, it probably will. It probably will. So that's a shock, I think, for therapists to hear that, because they're frightened to work in it. And, I feel like I'm almost speaking out of two sides of my mouth, because on one level I'm saying you should work in it. Honestly, it's incredibly powerful and interesting. But at the same time, it is very, very, very difficult. I've never really experienced such a level of we cannot talk about, censorship within the therapy room. You know what I mean? So there is a level that it is exhausting sometimes.
We want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. The team and members of GenSpect strive to promote high-quality, evidence-based care for gender nonconforming individuals. GenSpect is pleased to offer a non-medicalized approach to gender with their recently published Gender Framework, and they continue to hold conferences around the world. Visit genspect.org to learn more.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now back to the show. It's so true. And I remember hearing Marcus Evans, the UK clinician who wrote that wonderful book, Gender Dysphoria, along with Sue Evans, his wife. I remember once he said something like, when a patient comes in to therapy and says, we could talk about everything except this one thing, it means that's the thing that really you should keep in your back pocket to come around to. And I guess the difference between, maybe it's the gender dysphoria, maybe it's the indoctrination, maybe it's also the profile of young person who's dealing with this. They do tend to have autistic traits. They tend to be incredibly sensitive. They tend to have emotional dysregulation issues. So maybe that's also why they are so touchy, right? But I think to think about Marcus Evans's comment, I would say, I'm going to remember that one thing that they said we can't talk about, and I'm not going to raise it right now. I'm going to say, oh, okay, let's talk about everything else. And then I might say, perhaps this is a topic we might come back to at some point later down the line. So that's what I mean about the pace. I find that you just have to take things a little bit slower. And the process of establishing trust is different too, especially I think working with adolescents, because many times the parents are the ones encouraging them into therapy. So the client is already somewhat resistant to bonding with you. That's not always true. Sometimes the kid's thrilled and begging for therapy, and they come in with like a long list of topics and they want to say everything. But sometimes it's not. And they're very reserved, and they are struggling to identify their emotions. And so, you really have to build up a strong rapport before you start veering into those challenging topics. And I think therapists should also, if they are kind of unsure whether or not to wade into these waters, I would say, trust the process. As a clinician, every client you have teaches you things. Every therapy session you have teaches you things. And hopefully we're always growing and improving our skills. And so even if you run into some, therapy sessions where you have no idea what to say, no idea what to do, or you say the wrong thing and you realize, okay, I could have selected a much better reflection or whatever, that's okay. It's part of the process. And, frankly, I don't know if there's ever a level of competence that we reach that we go into therapy with 100% certainty that everything we say and do is going to be most helpful. That's just not how it works. We're a human being dealing with another human being, and our personalities interact and sometimes clash. And I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that happens in a session. So I know, a lot of therapists feel ill-equipped, but you will learn a lot in this work.
Yeah. It's a very, very powerful work. I think what was the word I was going to say? Jonathan Shedler on Twitter, he's a therapist, and he talks a lot about, the process and the psychological process. And, he always gets me thinking. I don't agree with everything, but he certainly, he gets my brain going, if you follow me, because he's very challenging. He's very forthright. And he's kind of shouting at us, us therapists, you're doing it wrong. But I think it's very interesting when he does talk like that, because it reminds me that we need to value the therapeutic process.
Yeah.
And you nailed it earlier when you said the reduction in symptoms. You know what I mean? Sometimes we can be very absorbed in the reduction of symptoms, and actually that's not what we should be all about. I love, and I think my biggest strength as a therapist is the relationship. I can build a relationship. I'm good at building. I get into it. I just I join them. You know what I mean? And I know that's where my value is in therapy, is I just want to get to know them on their deepest level. I just do.
Yeah.
And when you look at actually the evidence of psychotherapy, whether it's psychoanalysis or CBT or humanistic and all the different types of therapy that's out there, it's actually the relationship with the therapist is the thing that counts the most by far, in a way.
Yeah.
And so if a therapist is worrying and they're listening and we're trying to sell them, come into the black hole of gender, I think that they should remember that if you can build a relationship with your client, you won't be going wrong, because that relationship will give them a steady base. It'll be a safe harbor for them to find themselves. And that's what we offer. I think that's actually very valuable.
Yeah. That's so true. And I mean, in the CTA meeting, you could really sense that some clinicians had built a very strong relationship with their patient. And when that's the case, you almost kind of intuitively will figure out what to do about the gender. Whereas if you're very focused on like the labels and the definitions and the, language and the, forced compelled speech issue, you will have a hard time building the relationship, and then you'll lose touch with what your kind of instinctive knowing tells you in therapy sessions.
It's funny. I often thought of this up in the north of Ireland. I often thought, I wonder what it would have been like being a therapist up the north. And effectively, you would have had Catholic therapists for Catholic clients and Protestant therapists for Protestant clients, and there wouldn't have been a crossover.
Wow.
And yet, yeah, and it would have been very, very interesting had there been, if you follow me. It would have, yeah. But that's what it must be like. All over the world, there must be kind of, segregated communities, and you go to one or you go to the other and you're not. And this is a little bit like a Protestant therapist and a Catholic client working together. And that is really dodgy, it's hard.
Yeah, because it's different belief systems and different worldviews. I want to come back to that. I wonder if we could take a couple of minutes. We maybe should have done this earlier, but to tell our listeners about our new Substack.
Oh, yes. Well done, Sasha. Good
Thank
woman.
you. I totally forgot earlier. But so, those of you listening, you may know we used to have a listener community on Patreon. Yes. And we have completely, thanks to the help of our team, we've completely
our fabulous
moved,
team.
A lot of work over the holidays, moved everything into our Substack, and we have some kind of new offerings there. So, of course, you could just join our Substack for free, and you'll have access to, the transcripts, which we had before, and all of our weekly episodes. But then there are also a couple of offerings for paid members. So if you become part of our kind of first tier of membership, you'll have all of our bonus content, which is like the dinner party conversations, the extended episodes, and access to kind of like future exclusive content, which we produce weekly. And there's discussions there. And I mean, as you know, we have some amazing listeners, and they write incredible comments, very thoughtful, lots of great episode ideas in there. So you can kind of participate. And then we have a new founding members section, which is really cool. So if you become a founding member, you'll get advance notice about who's coming up the following month. And you can submit questions that we may be able to ask the guest. So if there's a guest coming on that you particularly love and you're really interested in what they think about this or that thing, your founding membership could give you access to posing those questions to them. And, you'll also know about events that we're doing early in webinars and things like that.
Yeah, Substack is a very interesting kind of concept. This whole concept of independent media, it's kind of freed people like us to kind of be able to publish our thoughts. And it's been a revolution. When you look at people like Eliza Mondegreen and Lisa Selin-Davis, Colin Wright, obviously Helen Joyce, Abigail Schreier's Substack is phenomenal. Michael Schellenberger's is massive. There's so many Substacks now, obviously Jesse Single and Blocked and Reported and stuff, that it's a whole kind of revolution. It happened in music in the 1980s, where basically the musicians took power and said, we're going to release our own music, and it became indie music. And now it's indie media. It's like, we're going to release our own media, thank you very much. And Substack has become the platform. And it's perfect for our podcast. We're among our friends. It really does feel like a community. And I think I've really been sold into this way. The way kind of social media can be very rat-a-tat, and it can be very... it can be very bitty and bad for the brain, I think. There's something about it, very fragmented. That's the word. While if you're in Substack, it's a much cleaner vibe, and you're just reading different people's articles. It's a much calmer, cleaner. I really am quite evangelical about it. I think, obviously, I've got my own Substack and I'm really into it. I just find I've found my place. I found my home. I used to be over on Facebook. Then I got bored of Facebook, went over to Twitter, and it felt like I went from the community hall eating my buns and drinking my tea to going into a nightclub where they're all taking cocaine. I was like, wild! So I hung out on Twitter for the last few years, and now I'm like this strung out wreck. I've had enough of the nightlife of Twitter. And so now I'm in the clean living, thoughtful and reflective space.
You're like coming down off of a cocaine bender of Twitter. That's hilarious.
Totally.
Wow. I had never thought of it that way. Okay.
Well, this movement has happened. I didn't touch Twitter. I was all over Facebook, and I didn't touch Facebook. And now I'm really leaving Twitter now, and I'm over at Substack. It's just lovely. It's a very pleasant place to be.
Yeah.
So, I advise and recommend people to come on over to Substack.
Come to our Substack. Yes.
Me and you did this very much to spread the word way back in 2020 or whenever we first started it. And, we've done it, and it's our labor of love, and we do it, and, we're really into it. But like, if you do want to support us, we do put an awful lot of work into it. Our team puts
Yeah.
an awful lot of work into it. And this is not where we make our money, not by a long, long shot. And so if anybody wants to recognize that, we would say thank you very much, because it is something that we love doing it, but it takes a lot of time. There's no doubt about it.
So we were talking earlier about what happens when a therapist and a client have very different worldviews.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that, like, I remember being in graduate school, and this was a very normal skill that is expected of therapists. It is not the first time that therapists have to hold their own personally held beliefs lightly while the client has a different set of personally held beliefs. Now, I think because the ideology and dogma has been shoved down people's throats so badly, it creates a very different dynamic. But if you can kind of process that and set it aside, I don't think it's new for therapists to have a client who maybe holds some beliefs that don't jive with reality, with the therapist perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, indoctrination is, we have the skills built in to work with it, but I think sometimes it just needs to be explicated. And, I give some talks and workshops around this because I think sometimes flushing it out is challenging. Like, well, how does it look in practice? But I actually think therapists already have the skills to work with indoctrination.
You're so right. And so often, like, let's say a client will come to me and they'll be working in a job that I would think, what are you doing in that job? God, or how are you living in that life? You know what I mean? I can think of one client who does this extraordinary commute, and I'm like, what? That's insane. But it's nothing to do with me. It's absolutely nothing to do with me. It's their life. I have to respect that their way of living is a very different way of living, very different demands than my way of living. And you live in that space. That's what a therapist does. We enter into their space and we respect their space. And our job is to kind of spot the pattern, see where it's working, see where it's not. You know what I mean? Walk with them, but we don't have to agree with everything. There's an extraordinary culture that has kind of come. It came in like a rocket, something like 2015, along with gender and everything else that's mad about life these days, with just this presumption we all have to agree. Like, crikey, it's mad. We always disagree with our clients about lots of things because we're human. But because it's so politicized, because it's so controversial, people think, well, how am I going to deal with the pronoun issue or whatever? And I'm like, they'll deal with it with every other issue that you don't agree with your client with. They'll deal it with skill and with empathy, and you'll get there. If you're used to dealing with a client, you'll be used to dealing with not agreeing with the client. But it does feel like it's a hot topic that therapists circle and don't work in. That's what I feel. I get these long emails that clearly have so much to say about gender. It's throbbing in their head, but they're not working in it, and that feels like massive missed opportunity.
Do you think that there are non-inflammatory ways that therapists can, maybe talk to colleagues and things like that about this? Because something that we were also talking about is just, we're in a new year, we're in 2024, and a lot of people feel like gender has been such a silencing and for lack of a better term, marginalizing issue. And I would love to give people listening, whether you're a therapist or a teacher or a parent, some kind of tools for how you can feel a little more confident or powerful, and not feel so intimidated by this topic. And I think we've touched a little bit on how that looks in the context of a therapy session, right? How do you approach this in a way that isn't so kind of conflictual or discombobulating? But what about therapists who say, I'm in a practice with 6 other clinicians, for example, and I've tried to voice some of my concerns around this and it's gone really badly. I wonder, is there like a non-inflammatory way to raise these issues? It's kind of what Dinner Party Conversations is
Yeah,
about over on our
I
Substack,
think
but what do you think?
there very definitely is, and I have a very definite answer, which I'm going to go for in a second about this. And I think it's something that we continuously avoid, and it's the kind of the elephant in the room, which is, what is your understanding of gender dysphoria? And if you ask, let's say if you're in a clinic and you ask the other therapist, so how do you understand gender dysphoria develops? And so
Yeah.
they might give gender identity theory as how it develops. And then you'd answer, "Oh, I see. Yeah, that's I know that theory well. I have a different understanding of it. I come from a different school of thought." And you'd explain your own thought, which is more a developmental model of understanding that you develop it maybe as a coping mechanism for distress in your life. And when you have put that dead dog on the table, when you have actually said, right, that's actually what we're talking about, it's in a very psychological manner. And it's not combative, because you first of all invited them to. Bet your bottom dollar, so often with people, they don't know that they're subscribing to gender identity theory. They're kind of just presuming that this is the understanding of gender. You know what I mean? They've kind of conflated it with being gay very often. This is how I read it.
Yeah.
They've
Yeah.
conflated with being gay. They haven't thought about it a huge amount, and they're just nodding along, just thinking, yeah, it's something in you. I haven't really thought about it, but yeah, it's something in you, and you just have to work with it, and you have to affirm. And so, okay, so that means you're in the kind of gender identity school of thought. I get you. Yeah, it's an interesting theory, and talk about it without shooting them down. So, well, I
Yeah.
don't. You've got a pink
Right.
essence, lady brain.
Right.
You don't start yelling about
Right.
lady brain, but you just talk. That's psychologically interesting, and I've traced the roots of that theory, and it is a very interesting theory, because it goes to the essence of what makes me, what makes me a woman. Is it because there's an identity within me, and is that identity very similar to my personality? Is it similar? What is that? Is my identity, like in other generations, Irish or Catholic or whatever? So what is my identity? So I would go quite psychologically with them,
Yeah.
and then allow them, or invite it towards the end, say, I come from a very different school of thought, but I do find that interesting, because it is interesting. There is an
Totally.
interesting
Totally.
kernel there. So that's how I would go for it. And I just find it amazing. I watch, reading Time to Think, Hannah Barnes' book, and the entire book, a full expose of Tavistock, and never once acknowledging that there is a fundamental two different ways of seeing gender dysphoria. And if you're in one camp, you're going to be for fast track medicalization. And if you're in the other camp, you're probably not.
Yeah.
And when I look at, like the CAS review, and just so you know, I don't know how many people would know this who is listening, but the GIDS at the Tavistock, it was going to close. It was going to close in March 23. Then it was, you know what I mean? And obviously it's a year later, it still hasn't closed, but it seems to be hitting roadblocks all over the place. And I'm like, since the time that clinic started in 1989, they have never confronted that.
Yeah.
They've never confronted which school of thought are. It's just clinicians are just presumed to be kind of thinking about gender without actually acknowledging, well, how do you think it develops? They're just always sidestep. I just think it's missing the entire point. I think we have to stop everything and discuss that, and then we
Yeah.
can go forward.
It just came to me. You know what I think is happening? I think
Okay.
clinicians assume that the interior life of a quote trans person is so alien and foreign that even though the theory they're being presented with via trainings and advocacy groups and psychological textbooks and stuff, even though they don't get it, they think, well, because I'm cis, I don't get it. I mean, of course I don't get it. I'm not trans. So yeah, this doesn't make a ton of sense. It's not super cohesive, but who am I to question this?
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating, because I think it perhaps indicates like a lack of confidence to be curious, to be trying to genuinely, earnestly want to understand something. And it just what you were talking about, like regarding how to address your colleague, just makes me think the value of asking genuine questions.
Yeah.
Of saying, well, what's your understanding of gender dysphoria? It's very different to saying, well, did you know that blah, blah, blah percentage of kids are blah, blah, blah? You know, that's a combative stance. And I'm so guilty of it. Like I've done it so many times. But just asking a curious question gives people the chance to really think through it or say out loud what they think and maybe even recognize that they don't know what they're talking about.
Can I take up on your point about being cis, being so exotic? I think this is key. I think people think, and especially, maybe I'm wrong. I remember Helen Joyce once said it and it really stuck in my mind, that especially for men, because men are so affectionate towards their genitals, they're like, anybody who would want to remove their genitals couldn't be a man. They couldn't be a man like I'm a man, so they must be a woman or something else. Do you know what I mean? I think that is really true. And I think, we talk a lot about the fathers and where are the fathers in this. And I watch men when I'm talking about gender, there's a shutdown. And I think that's where their brain goes. And our genitals as women, we have our breasts, but our genitals aren't outside our body as something. I think there's it's not as shockingly violent, if you follow me, because our vaginas aren't kind of hanging out there. I know this is very graphic, but I actually think it's a key point that they just go. And I remember Michael Schellenberger said it recently because he's very much got into the mental health around homelessness. And he said, don't underestimate people's body horror, that they just go, shut down, can't think, stop. And I think this is what happens. And I think as well as that, there's a conflation with being gay. And I don't understand what it is like to fancy this person and not fancy that. But you know what I mean? I know what I fancy. I'm within the usual. I'm within the majority because I fancy men. And so I can see how the conflation happens along with the body horror and the exotic kind of, I can't imagine doing that. Yeah. And so it just feels like such an unusual thing. They just think, I don't understand it, I must respect it. Rather than coming in what you were saying, which is a genuine psychological curiosity of what's going down for you. Yeah. Tell me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we should maybe one day do an episode about asking questions. Like the therapeutic value and the cultural value of asking questions. Not interrogation, because that happens a lot, but genuine questions. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I just think a lot about my approach to indoctrination, and really a lot of what I'm doing is genuinely asking questions.
My first lecturer, and she really was phenomenal, Fiona was her name. She was my first lecturer in counselling. She was just a genius about questions. She just was all about curiosity, questions, getting the right question will get everything. And so I think I was trained very well in that particular approach. Yeah. And I think it really does. It calms everybody down. If you ask somebody the right question, they go, well.
Yes.
And off they go. And they're kind of finding their place and you're getting to know them. It just works so well. And so for not only therapists, for parents or anybody who's there trying to get through to somebody, if you can get the right question without it being an interrogation, with it kind of being a curious. Now it's hard because if you feel like saying, oh my God, what is going down? Yeah. And instead you're trying to gently flick out a thought-provoking, conversation-inducing question. It's a very different brain space.
Totally.
And that's why we're lucky, because we're sitting in a chair, we're sitting back. It's only for conversation because we're therapists. That's why we're here. So we're in a very special place that brings on conversation that in fairness, nobody else is in. But, for therapists who are listening, I think it's key to kind of unlocking things.
Yeah, I think, back to the question about like, how do we give people non-confrontational ways of raising this? I love your suggestion of asking questions. Another thing that comes to mind that I think can be helpful is to talk a little bit about your own trajectory with things. So, you might ask the question, you might say something like, I also used to think that. Now, of course, you have to be honest, right? But you might say, like, when I first learned about gender, I had this one patient and they really seemed like the typical case you'd imagine. Because a lot of therapists will say this, like, I had one gender patient in 1997 and they had gender dysphoria their whole lives, and they transitioned. They were pretty happy. You know, a lot of times it's a female to male who was a lesbian who just got so tired of like all the discrimination. So it's really sad in a lot of ways. But, you know, then they'll say, but then I got a kid who came in who was very feminine, but she was saying she was a boy. And I was really confused. You know, so like if you can kind of describe your own evolution or thought process in a way that humanizes you, it can perhaps change the perception of the other person from, oh, this is a caricature of some sort of like religious zealot who just believes in like God's perfect bodies born the right way, versus, you know, like a clinician who's thinking and evaluating and trying to understand and grappling with questions and seeing things evolve. Or, you know, I was all on board with this until I learned about this detransitioner, and I could not believe, you know, the kind of medical care they received. So it could be really helpful, I think, to rather than coming in with a hard stance saying, oh, you know, I've really gone through an evolution here myself, and here's where it started and here's where it's going, or things like that. And, you know, I think it's really difficult if you start out in a kind of political conversation. And unfortunately, as the political narratives infuse even more and more and more into gender, it's easy for people on either side to caricature the other side, if that makes sense. So it's just,
I think there are two camps, and they think, well, I shouldn't say they, but, you know, you could argue affirmative people think that we are bigoted, and that we're kind of anti-gay and anti-trans, and
that we just want conformity and like, traditional roles.
So our job is to kind of humanize and kind of complexify the situation. But I had this kind of interaction with a journalist recently, which is kind of a salutary tale, that I should have declared the gender identity, gender dysphoria model earlier in the conversation. So I thought she had a very good understanding of gender. She was asking me questions back and forth. And then we kind of moved into email because she'd got the guts of the interview, and we moved into email. And then she just finished with one last question. What would you do if, and it was a real throwaway, it was all done. She was very happy, it was all done. I said, what would you do if you met a truly transgender child? And I was like, oh God. Right. And so then I gave a kind of a lengthy conversation about, well, the way I view gender dysphoria is, and I think she was just stupefied by it, astonished by this, because she truly thinks that there is these truly transgender people in this world. It was a really, I don't know, it was an eye-opener for me, but it made me realize we sometimes, because, well, I'm in the weeds of gender so much, I just forget just how many people just presume there is these trans people in the world. And I think it has become incredibly pervasive. You were saying an extraordinary story earlier about what you read in Eliza Mondegreen's recent article, which kind of is an indication, I'm sure you'll tell us now, but an indication of it has gone into the culture on a level that it's just really, really kind of, it has really entered the culture. And people to think that they're kind of going to get rid of trans and things like that, I think they're so on the wrong kind of level, that this has come in and it's going to stay. I don't see this moving, but I think it has to move to a healthier place. It has to move to a deeper understanding. When people first heard about depression, they hadn't a notion. When people first heard about alcoholism, like Bill, who started Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1930s, it was unbelievable what people's thoughts around alcoholism was. Like, it was just so punitive. These are bad people with bad thoughts that need to be punished. That was the attitude in the 1930s. It was unbelievable. And so we've moved on in our understanding. The same with depression. People thought it was like, I don't know, that was really a skew version. But I think we have a job to do with public awareness and gender. And tell us what you were reading about. It's a phenomenal story.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so Eliza Mondegreen had an article. This was from the summer of 2023, and it's a quote from something she read online in one of those communities. And the quote is, "My friend's roommate gave me a shot of tea at a Barbie party Now I'm questioning everything. And essentially, it was a young person who went to a Barbie themed party who I think was like questioning their identity, but was maybe non binary or something like that. And found it's a female, found herself in a conversation with a female to male person who had been transitioning medically for a couple of years. And the FTM trans guy said, yeah, I'll answer any questions you have. So this girl was thrilled and just started like bombarding the trans guy with questions, questions, questions. And of course, throughout the conversation, she, quote, realized that she too was trans because they had so many similar experiences. Shocker, two females with similar experiences. Wow.
Chatting at a party, ask me
Yeah.
anything. It's turning into a slumber party, but yeah.
I know. So then, towards the end of the conversation, the trans guy says to her, well, you seem so excited. Do you want to try a shot of tea right now? I have some. And so he went and got his like little syringe and testosterone and injected her with tea. And she was elated. She felt powerful. She felt incredible. And she said, that was it. The next week I was at the gender clinic getting my own prescriptions. So,
And then the comments underneath, oh yeah, me too. That's how I first started tea. I started tea at a party.
Yeah, there were a couple people saying something like that. Of course, some comments were like, this is dangerous. These are powerful drugs. You shouldn't just mess with them willy-nilly. But then some people were saying, well, you seem happy. No, who are we to judge? I'd love to do an episode on kind of toxic positivity and toxic empathy. But the point is, gender is in our world in a new way that is here to stay. And, you and I will continue to follow all of the evolving. It's like a rotating door of new consequences and phenomena that are evolving out of this thing. And it's gonna keep changing, but there's no putting it back in the box.
Yeah.
And all that to say, it's a fascinating and engrossing world. We hope that people don't get sidelined from their old professions, but if you are interested in the gender world and you're a therapist or any kind of professional, or you want to learn more about it, please don't hesitate to get involved, because this is an important cultural topic and medical topic and psychological topic that we will be working in for a long time. So
I really want to add to that, like that. I think any therapist who's thinking, if they're very absorbed by it, I would encourage you, join in, join therapy first. Or have a look at Beyond Trans. We've got a directory of therapists, and you're just working with detransitioners, so you might not feel the stakes are so high because you're just dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of, you don't feel like they're going to rush off and transition. So don't forget Beyond Trans is another. And there's then Critical Therapy Antidote. They're an organization, and they're very, very thoughtful. And then there's, of course, the Thoughtful Therapists, which are based in the UK, and they're a phenomenally lovely, lovely group of people. I have to say, big hello to the Thoughtful Therapists. I'm very fond of the Thoughtful Therapists. And when you think about, like, in the 60s, just to finish, like, when you think about in the 60s, there was all these psychedelic drugs, and it brought, the doors of consciousness were being opened and all sorts of things. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was more of these kind of speedy type drugs and kind of club drugs, and it was kind of dancey and all this. Now, with the idea, this kind of Black Mirror scene of tea being offered at the Barbie party, it's like identity drugs have now arrived. They are not going anywhere fast. Settle in. I'm sorry, but this is not going anywhere fast. This is going to be around for a long time. And so therapists who are looking at it, I think you inevitably are going to end up working in it. You'd be better off joining, like I say, something like Beyond Trans, where you're just starting off in the waters of trauma, which most therapists know how to work in.
Yeah.
And then move in slowly, maybe work with a few parents, and then maybe start working with young people. There is a trajectory you can follow. And there's training and stuff. There's a community in therapy first where they really look after the therapists and stuff like that. There's so much out there now.
Yeah.
I really want to encourage therapists. Contact us. We'll introduce you if you need to, or go straight to therapy first or whatever. And you really will find a big community there.
Yeah. We hope that was instructive for listeners and, parents and detransitioners, anyone listening to us. They often wonder, like, what the heck's going on with therapists? And we hope this episode kind of shed a little bit of light.
You brought up a very interesting point earlier, Sasha, about how when it's to do with gender, the client often doesn't want to reduce the symptoms. In fact, they cling on to the symptoms. There's a whole psychology around going on about that. I think that could do with more discussion. I kind of flicked over it and actually I went, that's really interesting. So I'd like to discuss that more maybe when we go into our bonus content.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I find that clients are very protective. They don't want to relieve their dysphoria insofar as they won't be trans anymore. And many of them just really want to be trans. So if this is something you're interested in,
Yeah.
we will go into it in much more detail in our Substack. So please join us over there in our listener community, and we will dive into that topic some more. Anyway, we're glad to be back. And we are excited for this season. We have some amazing guests coming up. We have some really cool projects in the work. We're going to be talking to attorneys. We're going to be talking about all these detransition cases. We're going to be talking to Kathleen Stock, like lots of big names and very interesting topics.
January Little John, all sorts of brilliant,
lots of
brilliant
great people.
names.
So we're looking forward to it. It was great to see you, Stella.
You too.
All right. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, a Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.